All right, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Once again, we are back taking a look at the tropics. Today is Saturday, August 31st, 2019, and we remain tracking major Hurricane Dorian, now a 150 mile an hour Category 4 hurricane that is very close to Category 5 intensity as it does approach the northern Bahamas over the next 48 hours, Florida from there, and then eventually turning up the southeast U.S. coastline. The storm is still very powerful, incredibly dangerous, but we do have some new news this morning in terms of the new track and the forecast intensity, as well as some things to look at related to that. So let's go ahead and get right to it as we do. The first 2 or 3 minutes will get you in, get you out, and then we'll loop back and talk about some more to do with the storm. Latest track from the National Hurricane Center is 11 a.m. Maximum sustained winds again 150 miles an hour and a slower forward movement of just 8 miles an hour to the due west. The first things first, hurricane watches remain up for the northern Bahamas. Grand Abaco is the first Bahama island to be impacted to on the right side there, and then the islands to the left there will also be taking the major hit from the storm, with these islands taking a secondary fringe effect from the storm, at least tropical storm conditions, possible hurricane conditions, and that will be pretty close from now. Talking about tomorrow afternoon, about 24 hours from now, we'll be seeing those conditions really going downhill. But the problem for the Bahamas is this stall or Dorian's just going to sit for a day or two. So these people are definitely going to be in for a really, really bad time with a very strong hurricane essentially sitting over them for an extended period of time. But then this is the new Hurricane Center forecast track. And if you've been watching from last night, you'll notice this is much further offshore than it was over the last few days. This track is significantly shifted offshore. The overnight advisory had the storm grazing the coastline right here around West Palm Beach and then moving very, very, very close to the coast or almost directly onshore up the 95 corridor, and then 11 p.m. was just hair offshore, and then 5 a.m. they shifted a little bit offshore, and then now we're talking about another trend offshore. Again, with this forecast cone, you cannot focus directly on the center of the cone. All I'm showing you is that the trend of the cone is moving to the east. If you are in the cone of a major hurricane, you have to prepare for hurricane effects. It is that simple. Nobody that's in this cone can let their guard down yet or say, well, it's not going to come to me anymore. I don't have to worry about it. We are talking about a very light steering flow situation. As we talked about the last few days, the ridge, the high pressure that is pushing Dorian to the west will leave. It will abate and it will flow away from the storm. And what it's going to do is it's going to slow down significantly as it approaches the Bahamas. And where exactly this turn occurs is still definitely questionable. And any changes in that trajectory doesn't take much to significantly change how the storm affects the U.S. coastline. Remember Hurricane Matthew in 2016 raked Florida's coastline kind of like this, and the storm caused $3 billion worth of damage, and it did not make landfall. This eye stayed offshore. So don't still take this lightly, or don't think with one little shift that everything is magically better. But for Florida, this does look like an improvement. You will still have a major hurricane very close to the state going into Monday afternoon through Wednesday morning, if not or into Wednesday afternoon. But it does appear that a landfall is much less likely today. I would say conditions have vastly improved for South Florida, looking much better, and the Panhandle with the Gulf crossover is almost completely off the table at this point. So I would say the Gulf Coast is in the clear. South Florida looks much, much, much better, and the conditions look like they could improve for the East Coast, but this does look worse for the North and South Carolina region. Instead of having an onshore system that would bring you secondary rainfall effects, now we're talking about potentially hurricane, especially tropical storm, if not hurricane conditions occurring for parts of the coast from the Georgia Florida border northward to North Carolina sometime later this week. But that exact timing, intensity, and whatnot remains to be seen. So we'll have to see a little bit more about that. So that's kind of your latest 2 quick minute just update. That is the latest on Dorian. Please keep preparing if you have been. If you're in this cone, do not let your guard down just yet. So let's loop back to the satellite imagery. There's a couple things I want to show you here this morning on our high resolution goes 1 minute visible or infrared imagery, so we can see the eye wall structure a little bit better. And Dorian has continued to improve throughout the morning. Its structure was a little eroded this morning. There was some northerly wind shear that was kind of breaking down the western half of the storm, but you can see over the last few hours Dorian built back that western eye wall, that western kind of overcast canopy around the eye, and it is looking a little bit better. As that northerly wind shear is probably abated a little bit in the upper levels. We can see, though, the path of Dorian is still pretty clear for the next 2 or 3 days. We do see that weakness here as the clouds continue to move off in this direction. Notice how in the north you still have these clouds kind of moving across like this. This is kind of giving Dorian his northerly buffer, and it's also putting the storm in this westerly steering flow. And we can see the weakness out ahead of the Dorian, so it's just going to kind of follow along in this weakness for now, which puts Grand Abaco and the rest of the northern Bahamas on notice here as the hurricane center's track is going to take them very almost directly over, if not very, very close to them. And this, up to this point, we're pretty confident up until this point of where Dorian's going to go. Then the turn's trajectory is what's in question. Another thing that is in question is the intensity a little bit. The Hurricane Center's new forecast discussion does have Dorian approaching, currently is 150 miles an hour. Category 5 begins at 156, so we are only a little bit off Category 5 intensity. I said last night, do not be surprised this thing briefly achieves Category 5 status, and I'm sticking to that. They believe at 155 miles an hour in 12 hours as Dorian continues to strengthen. I think we're starting to see the beginnings of an eye wall replacement cycle. This is when the eye of the storm will tighten up and tighten up and tighten up until it can't anymore. The eye will drop out and a new, bigger eye will take over. This typically increases the size of the storm, like the actual physical size in all directions will get bigger, and the wind field will expand, and hurricane force winds will reach further from the center of the storm, but it will weaken in terms of the maximum wind speeds, which is what we gauge these on. Could be starting, maybe not. These are very difficult to predict. It kind of starts to get that look a little bit. We'll see how that plays out. But until it does, these wind speeds will slowly increase. Hurricane under aircraft flying the system have found winds as high as 145 knots. Although I suspect this is probably not accurate. It's probably a little bit off. This may have been just a downburst and a really intense thunderstorm. I think that maybe it may have been, a downburst or something because it's a little bit of dry air. Not real sure yet. The pressure is about 945, 947 millibars, which is not astronomically low, especially not for a category 5, but Dorian is not a big storm, and pressure and wind speeds do go together, but there's also a relation to the storm size. If a storm is massive, it needs a super low pressure to achieve category 4 or 5 winds, where a smaller storm like Dorian doesn't need that pressure to be all that low. So it's plausible, but somewhat unlikely. But it doesn't. The point is, it doesn't take much for Dorian to achieve that Category 5 status for now. From there, it looks like Dorian would pretty much hold at intensity, or maybe weaken then slightly if the eye wall replacement were to happen. But it will approach the Bahamas as a very powerful top end Category 4 hurricane, and there's not much left to slow it down. In terms of steering, guys, like we've talked about the last few days, the high pressure ridge to Dorian's north is what's steering it right now. The high pressure ridge in the mid levels is still very strong, and that's what's keeping Dorian on that due west or west northwest track. We can see it on the satellite imagery. But as I step through here to tomorrow morning or late tonight, you can see that ridge is already weakened considerably and moved away. And as it moves further away, we're simply going to run out of things to steer Dorian as Dorian finds itself in a very light steering flow. See how now this is Sunday afternoon or late Sunday morning approaching the Bahamas, but running out of steering flow essentially and kind of being in this no man's zone before this trough here can sort of coax it northward with a weakness. It's just going to kind of hang out. So it's very important to see how Dorian approached these islands. If it's slowing down maybe here, the turn could be a lot sooner. If it still is driving pretty good and doesn't start turning until late, then we're talking about a situation where the coastline gets a lot more in the way of impacts. Determining impacts is going to be a little sketchy right now still. I would say for Florida, we can kind of start to guess if this track were to hold. We'll use the 12Z or the 0Z European model because that looks to be about what the Hurricane Center has on their forecast right now. This is a rainfall forecast, and we're seeing that the rainfall totals have come down tremendously. Now we're talking just a few inches. So being on the west side of the system is the drier side of the system. That makes the rainfall totals far less than they were if the storm were to come up the coast and dump all its rain on the right side, where we were talking a foot, 2 feet of rain. Now we're talking maybe just a few inches of rain, which is definitely good news. And if we look at the wind gust forecast on the European here, as Dorian does work up the coast, you see once again that approach the Bahamas, slow turn as it stalls, and then that northerly resume course. We see that tropical storm conditions begin in Florida sometime here around 6Z Wednesday, which is just going into early Wednesday morning, where tropical storm force gusts could be occurring And then the maximum gusts for the northern Florida area would be occurring right here at around 52 miles an hour. And then, for the southern half of the state, kind of the same thing. We're talking again about 40, 50 mile an hour gusts would kind of be the story for most of the state. And that would be pretty much at the coastline. As you get inland to the inland counties, we're talking about more tropical depression winds to just a windy day. So tropical storm conditions probably still likely from most of the east coast of Florida, but if the storm does stay further offshore, we are not talking about any major hurricane impacts, and hurricane force gusts would be very confined unless the storm did begin to shift back west, which would quickly increase these numbers. So I stress the uncertainty that remains here with that. And then from there, guys, the Carolinas, you're going to be up next. We just, until this turn happens, it's not worth talking about specifics yet. It's just not. If the turn is way sooner, this could be nothing. If the turn is late and this thing gets real close to Florida, that puts hurricane conditions potentially for you guys. If I lived on the coastline of North or South Carolina or even coastal Georgia, I would still be preparing for a hurricane near the coast. Inland, I would not be super worried, but I'd be preparing for a tropical storm. And then if I lived on the coast, I'd be preparing for a hurricane right now. And that's how you have to treat it until things change. And hopefully they keep changing. Hopefully this monster stays offshore and we can all breathe a sigh of relief. But it's just, we're a little bit on the outside of being able to confidently say that yet. So anyway, guys, that's what I got for you here this morning. Appreciate you watching. And as always, if you have any questions, let me know in the comments or message me, however you want to do it. And stay safe, keep preparing, don't let your guard down, and we'll watch and track this thing as it goes along. So have a good one, guys. Thanks for watching and take it easy.